Okay. All right. Well, we'll get started. There are a few more set to join, but we'll certainly let them in as and when they do. So thank you, everybody, for joining. My name's Alex Trusty. I'm a consultant at the Equality Group, and you'll see me quite a lot as I am the lead for the Inclusive Index think tank. So welcome to our first think tank event. Each and every one of you in this exclusive community is here because you represent some of the most progressive private equity and venture capital firms worldwide. You have all shown commitment to continually evolving diversity and equity and inclusion within your own workplace and have been ranked amongst our top 20 inclusive index for the VC and PE industries. As part of our think tank community, it's important to remember that you are in a safe space. We're here to encourage you to have discussions about difficult D&I topics, and even more importantly, try to create solutions and results using the latest academic research and guidance from industry leaders. You are invited to our quarterly member-only events. You will have access to our think tank learning portal and will have assistance from our expert consultants and academic partners throughout the year. We will also work with you to increase your inclusive index score for 2022. Our role as consultants here at Equality Group is to provide you with support along your D&I journey. We want to support companies who genuinely want more representation, want more access to top talent, want to make better investment decisions, and also to perform better. One of the ways of doing this is to collect data and monitor it on a continual basis. We believe that change is coming. We believe that organizations genuinely want more representation, less bias, and more inclusion. However, there is a lot of apprehension and mystery around the topic. We have advised and helped companies to create more gender-balanced workforces and have seen the influence that data, targets, and research has played on pushing towards more gender equality. We feel that by working together, we can really make some genuine strides moving forward. Today, we're going to channel in on collecting ethnicity data. For many, it is a grey area, which means that very little action has been taken or done to first collect it, but secondly, use it in a progressive way. What we'd like to do is break down the process for you so that you feel more confident when discussing data and gather the benefits sooner rather than later. We are joined by our head of research, Dr. Keon West, who will provide you with some insight into our inclusive index benchmarking tool. Keon, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. Apologies for showing up just at the very last second. I do have children and I had to hand them over before I could come. So if you hear anyone screaming in the background, then that's what's going on. So about the index, it's really just, I'm going to give a very, very brief discussion about it. Really, it's just the old adage that if nothing is measured, then nothing gets done. And a lot of companies say on some level that they'd like to do particular things to improve diversity or inclusion in their workplace, but that is usually a bit of a vague goal. So it's not as solid a goal as specific goals around profit margins or expansion of the business into new areas. Those goals are specific. So we think if you're going to do something about diversity and inclusion, what exactly are you going to do? How do you know if you're doing it well? And how do you know if you're doing it better than other people? So the index contains a range of different things broken down into subcategories. Some of them are incredibly easy. So they're just things like the representation on your website. Who do you see when we go to your company's website? Do we see all white people? Do we see all men? Do we see something more complex than that? Some of it's around language. So does your language implicitly assume that the people are of particular demographic characteristics? Does it assume a certain kind of family, certain kind of sexual orientation? Some of them are incredibly difficult, or at least they take a lot more work to fix in the short term. So they have to do with the leadership structure of the company. When we look at the top of the company, the managers, what's the demographic breakdown there? And because there's a wide range, of course, some things are worth more than others. Some of the questions I normally get around the index is this imperfect? Once you get a measure of something? Won't people just start cheating to get higher scores on the measure? And the answer is, of course, yes, because that's true about everything. But the solution to that is not to abandon a measure. It's generally to improve a measure. So we wouldn't accept a world in which we didn't have a measure to determine whether someone was qualified to be a doctor or a lawyer. We just get better and better measures. And that's what we're aiming to do here as well. So some things you can cheat on and just tick the boxes. Some things are much more difficult to do that for, and we set it up that way deliberately. I'm going to stop there because I'm not sure if people have questions or what kind of questions you have, but I'd be very happy to answer them if you do.
Feel free to unmute your mics if you do have any questions about the inclusive index at all. But we will also have a Q&A session towards the end of the session, so feel free to keep this going. Okay. Thank you, Keon.
You're very fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen and introduce you to two of our legal advisors who will be assisting us on this webinar. So firstly, we are joined by Amanda Chabarek, who is the Disputes and Litigation Data Lead at Norton Rose Fulbright. Amanda will provide us with guidance on how to collect D&I data across Europe and North America. Amanda has a keen interest in exploring frameworks and data strategies for the development of D&I monitoring programs and is a trusted advisor to the group. Following that, I would like to introduce you to David Ampor, who is a partner at DLA Piper, specialized in distressed debt, restructuring, and special situations. David is a co-sponsor of DLA Piper's Race and Ethnicity Employee Resource Group, Mosaic, and also sits on the D&I Council. He's also a director of Prime Commitment, which is a leading social mobility initiative focused on broadening access to the legal industry for young people from less privileged backgrounds. David will discuss challenges faced collecting ethnicity and race data with us. As mentioned, we will have a Q&A session, so please feel free to submit any questions you have using the chat function, and we'll try to answer those as best as possible for you. Following the Q&A session, we will have breakout discussions, which is a great opportunity for you to have discussions together and really discuss the findings that we've had from this session. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Amanda Chabarek of Norton Rose Fulbright.
Hi, everyone. For starters, thank you so much for having me, and I'm delighted to be here. To start off, I'm going to go straight into the European landscape in terms of the general data protection regulations. So going to the first slide that I've prepared, since this is a presentation focused on data, I created a semi-structured data set just comparing Article 6 and Article 9. So the lawful bases for processing are set out in Article 6. And at least one of these must apply whenever processing personal data. The most appropriate to use will depend on the purpose and the relationship with the individual. The lawful basis needs to be determined before processing and should be documented for best practice. The Information Commissioner Officer, the Information Commission, the ICO has an interactive tool which is quite helpful for this, which will be sent as a follow-up after the talk. So many of the lawful bases for processing depend on the process being what's called necessary. This doesn't mean that the processing has to be absolutely essential according to the ICO. What it needs to be is more than just useful, more than just standard practice and targeted, and it has to be a targeted and proportionate way of achieving a specific purpose. 5 of the conditions of processing are provided solely in Article 9 of the GDPR pertaining to sensitive data. The other 5 require authorization or a basis in UK law, which means you additionally need to meet the conditions set out in the 2018 Data Protection Act. So honing in on Article 9. So Article 9, special category data, is personal data that requires more protection because it is indeed sensitive. In order to lawfully process special category data, a lawful basis under Article 6 has to be satisfied, and a separate condition under Article 9 needs to be identified. So just from a quick glance, that for these conditions could, for some organizations, that in order to demystify what this means, this could already be not a barrier, but a practical consideration that an organization may not have yet wrapped their head around, even though when you put it and you kind of create a structured data set and you have it laid out, it's a lot more easy to digest. So just going into Article 6 further. So I just thought I'd show this, just the main regulation for Article 6, just to kind of see how it's laid out. So before I get into this, I want to first mention what a controller is, as defined by the UK General Data Protection Regulation. So a controller is a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or body which alone or jointly with others determines the means of the processing of personal data. So furthermore, controllers make decisions about processing activities and exercise overall control of the personal data being processed. So if someone was collecting DNI data, for example, they would be the controller of that data and have to comply with the associated responsibilities. So a controller can be a company or another legal entity. So Article 6, so for non-sensitive data, these are the key excerpts from the GDPR and break down the importance of consent. So consent I'm gonna touch on again, but it's really important to mention that the consent needs to be provided for the processing. And this will lead to the importance of when consent wording is drafted and to provide individuals who are participating in providing their data that they need to consent, and that this consent wording, I don't want to say needs to be seamless, but the consent wording, as well as what the initiative is covering, needs to be packaged very clearly. So moving on to Article 9. So Article 9 of the GDPR for sensitive data. So Article 9.2a, so the exemptions. So Article 9.2a is quite important for our purposes, as it permits you to process special category data if the data subject has given explicit consent to the processing of the personal data for one or more specified purposes, the ones which we covered on the other slide. So explicit consent unhelpfully isn't defined in the UK GDPR, but it needs to meet the usual, the standard GDPR wording for consent, namely that it must be freely provided, specific, affirmative, so opt-in, and ambiguous, and also be able to be withdrawn at any time. So I'm sure at some point we've all received emails from marketers or our favorite clothing brand, whether we'd like to opt in or whether we still want to receive updates. So I guess that's quite a digestible way of thinking the opt-in or unsubscribe, which we've all probably done at some point. So just to be particular, the additional requirements for consent to be explicit as detailed in the ICO is defined as directly from the ICO is explicit consent confirmed in a clear statement rather than by any other type of affirmative action, and the specific nature of the special category data being specified and separate from any other consents being sought. The Article 9.2b exemption is also important because it pertains to employment, social security, and social protection law. So a key, the European Handbook on Equality Data is a revised version of the original completed in 2007, which has been updated in light of current European frameworks and to promote best new practices for the member states. Its aim is basically to help member states in developing their data collection practices. So it's quite a lengthy document, but I just wanted to emphasize the parts that spoke to me and which I think are very, very relevant in collecting data. Is that it's true, it's collecting diversity monitoring within an organization isn't inherently problematic or technically challenging, and that there are two basic ways this can be carried out. So the collection of personal data coupled with associated record keeping and anonymous workforce surveys. So speaking to anonymous workforce surveys, when we first think of surveys, we think of almost SurveyMonkey and the usual ones, or even voting in Zoom within organizations. But anonymous surveys and ones where key identifiable factors are stripped out or a bit more tricky. I think what a good example is in my organization of around 7,000 people, I'm the only person with my role. So if it was free text and if I put, for example, my role, I'd be easily identifiable. So anonymizing the data is extremely important, but we'll touch back on, we'll get into that in further detail. Moving on to the handbook, I've included other not technical elements, but speaking to transparency and trust, which David will get into, is the handbook specifies that any employee being asked to provide data should be given a full explanation of the reasons, the importance of providing a response, and how the data will be used, and arrangements for maintaining it to keep information secure and confidential. So anytime, even thinking when you start a new organization, and you put in the not the matter opening forms, but the forms that say your information when you're starting a new organization, the knee-jerk reaction is just, oh, I'm starting, of course I'm going to provide this information. But providing more sensitive information, or when, for example, when you join an organization, it asks you to disclose if you have a disability, this disclosing sensitive data requires an organization to have an environment of psychological trust, or to have a safe environment where you want to feel comfortable disclosing that. But when you're just joining an organization, or when you haven't even joined, and let's say it's 2 weeks prior to your induction, you may not have yet made that assessment. So public image in an organization, how they appear to not just internal, external, is of utmost importance when participating in any kind of data collection, especially sensitive. So speaking on data integrity and continuance, that keeping the records up to date, this might seem quite simple, but a smaller organization might think, oh, the best way to keep a record is through Excel. Or an organization might use their existing financial management systems or their HR systems, but the continuance of data and data integrity and having indicative data set and having a data set that is structured is very, very important. And the European Handbook touches on this nicely by mentioning the necessary information during the application process and the adjustments to the database when the employment relationship ends. So on the US landscape, for different states, the rules, there are nuances, but all US companies on a general basis with at least 100 employees have to file reports with the federal government on the racial and gender composition of the workforce. And then for the Office of the Federal Contract Compliance, companies that are contracts for the US government must adapt affirmative action plans and file these to the OFCCP. It's also of note that there are federal requirements for affirmative action, and that the federal government contractors and subcontractors are required to act affirmatively in employing and promoting employees who are in protected groups based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, mental or physical disability, and veteran status. And also that the EEOC recommends anonymous self-reporting. So I've covered on a broad basis, the legal landscape and the regulatory landscape, as well as some of the technical elements. So what we have here is striking a balance that the reporting on sensitive data is conducive to D&I monitoring and data collection. And like what was mentioned earlier by Keon is if you're not assessing, in a sense, you're guessing. It's the whole element of accountability and having the information to inform strategy. And then the balance that also needs to be leveled is that the stringent, in some situations, privacy and data protection laws that limit the processing of sensitive categories of data, or at least require to make an assessment when saying what can we go to our colleagues for, what kind of information can we collect. So it's important that we rethink the standard methods for reporting key demographic dimensions about an organization's workforce to allow the accurate and lawful tracking of D&I efforts, especially across borders. So a method needs to be created that balances both of these elements and helps identify potential hidden inequities or biases that companies can't identify. And so companies can identify hotspots and understand their workforce better. So considerations for a D&I program, these are just considerations, and they're at quite a high level. But when creating a diversity and inclusion program, it's very important to think, well, what is the organization trying to accomplish? The reason this is of the utmost importance is that, well, the improved decision-making is a given, but what are the other goals? For example, is it a better understanding of the firm's diversity firm-wide or office-wide? Important to keep in mind that the results will also inform the future goals, and that the goals can change based on what's discovered from the first data set, and based on the responses. It's very likely that the goals might change, and that in turn the consent will change, and all the questions that are asked might change. So on other considerations for a program are what data points are being sought and collected. So when the survey, or the anonymized survey rather, is going to be sent out, it's very important that all the key stakeholders participate. And they also think not just the data that's going to be collected, what's the form? Is this going to be free text? Is this going to be multiple selection? Is this going to be, how is the data going to look? Is the output going to result in structured data? Are there going to be sections that, or is there going to be a section that says anything else you want to add? But what kind of data will it yield if there's an abundance of free text? What the point and metrics that are collected are very important. Who are the key stakeholders? What is the goal of the data collection? Even a time frame. Well, how long are we going to have this survey open? There's just so many considerations from a data perspective. The privacy policies and consent. So the legal basis for consent, touching upon GDPR, evaluating the privacy handling issues, having a task force to deal with all these considerations. Moving on to the definition of sensitive data in the different jurisdictions. I think a good example has an Article 6 lawful basis for processing the special category data been determined, and has an appropriate Article 9 condition for processing also been selected, and have the special categories of data being processed been documented, and is there an appropriate policy in place? Who's going to keep in charge of the raw data, and who's going to keep in charge of the policy? Is it the same person? Is it different teams within an organization? Determining the key, so in determining the key barriers, that's the methodological process of ensuring compliance, organizing a data impact assessment, developing clear notice and consent wording. And so organizations need to assemble a policy for the treatment of sensitive data, and also provide training with employees on how to comply with the policy. So just when GDPR training was done, I'm sure everyone in this call has had to do that. The same kind of training needs to be conducted, and the approach will also need to be customized based on global and geo-specific nuances. The key point is that there needs to be a clear record of the diversity data protection practices. And another bit that we were actually discussing before, and what was touched on when the employee relationship ends, is what happens when employees move on. Whilst the data at the that comes with the onboarding process, and just when the forms are sent to HR when you join a new organization, and as well as what's attained, for example, when someone when someone sends their CV and their resume, and just the information that is known to employees. When staff leave, this can have a major impact on the strategy too. Well, why did this individual leave? Where are they going? Why are they leaving? Did they leave because they think they'll have better professional development? Did they leave because maybe they wanted to join an organization who they believed had a better culture and ethos? There's so many reasons, and these reasons will be very difficult to determine if someone's left and there's no continuance with that relationship. So this can also, having a strategy to how to stay in touch with your former employees and seeing what they've got up to when they've moved on, and knowing why they've moved on, is also very important. Without further ado, and unless there are any questions, now on to David.
Thanks, Amanda. Alex, if you want to go ahead. Any questions?
I have questions for Amanda, unless anybody else has first.
No, of course. Hi, Sasha.
Hi, Amanda. So I'm Sasha, and actually one of Alex's colleagues at Equality Group. And I think what I just wanted to ask is, and that was a lot of great, very detailed information. The conversations that we very often have, especially within the EU context, it's people from Germany and France who, whenever we would love to conduct a survey, we get quite a direct, semi-emotional response saying, no, you're not allowed, you can't do this. Why are you asking us this? What would be the best? And that would be surveys that would include questions like ethnicity and gender. So when we have questions like that, what would be the best way of responding to them?
I think with the climate in France and Germany and very, very stringent rules for data collection is that, I'm not an expert in French and German law, but if there is an opt-in and if there's consent and if the individual consents to participating, I think the data protection lawyer in that region would basically need to determine the next best thing to consent and to have in place an anonymized survey and make sure they do all the checks to make sure that that's still compliant. But I think the kind of magic and proof would be in having very bespoke consent wording, and that the individual participating in a survey knows exactly that they're providing sensitive data and that they are opting in, and also that they have the right they also have the right to withdraw the information that they provide whenever that happens, and if that happens.
I think can I just add very briefly to that? One of the challenges that we face at my organisation, partner at DLA Piper, we've got over 4,000 employees globally. We operate in over 100 jurisdictions. Clearly, from a cultural perspective, there are a number of jurisdictions. Every jurisdiction differs, right? And we all know that the UK is very different to the Middle East, which is very different to Asia, which is very different to some of the places that we operate on the African continent, and in the African continent. South Africa is very different to Ghana, to Kenya. And that richness and diversity, I think, is part of the strength of my organisation, frankly. But that creates its own challenges in the way that you've identified, Sasha, in that there's not just the legal framework, but actually culturally, you just cannot ask those questions. Even before you get off the start mark, you cannot ask those questions, and/or the interpretation of those questions will differ in different jurisdictions. So the construct around, for example, social mobility, and what that means in the UK and what that means in Germany is quite different. Similarly, around constructs around race and ethnicity, a lot of that is born of the history of those particular countries, and actually culturally where those countries are at. So it's definitely one that we grapple with, in that we cannot have a uniform policy around collection of data which applies globally. We have to take a nuanced approach in each and every country in which we operate. And of course, the challenges are different in each and every country you operate. So the approach should be tailored and different. That creates all sorts of other challenges around, again, being smart, using resource smartly, and tailored to the particular country in which you might be seeking to advance the diversity and inclusion agenda.
And on that, David, do you think it would be very helpful to ensure that you provide those definitions when you send out the questionnaire, right? So sort of like we're collecting data on ethnicity. In this context, this is what we mean by ethnicity.
I think, and I'll come on to it in a little bit more detail, but I don't necessarily think it's as useful to direct people down a certain path, because again, you're looking for data integrity. So you do want to create some tramlines within which you're operating, but you don't necessarily want to skew the results by asking or directing people in a particular fashion, or asking them to fit into a particular box, when you cannot necessarily be absolutely you cannot be exhaustive in that list. You can suggest, and you can suggest other if a person doesn't necessarily identify. I don't get the sense, certainly from our experience, I don't get the sense that the definitional kind of criteria is actually that helpful, certainly from a UK perspective. It may well be the case overseas that is, but certainly the feedback that we've had is that that it doesn't create a kind of incremental benefit to have a lengthy or have those definitions in. Again, frankly, when I talk to some of the practical challenges, some of this is actually keeping people engaged in what they're doing, and the fact that people have effectively a day job. This is super important, but you need to make it as user friendly as possible, either from, as Amanda said, you're doing this on the web or on a phone or the like. And again, whilst there might be things which help the kind of data organization and interrogation in the long term, you've got to balance that with the kind of practicality of people's interaction with the survey itself.
No, that's great. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. I mean, we've got one more question from Jacqueline.
Oh, hi, thank you. I just had a quick question about collecting data in the recruitment process, which is different from collecting data from, your actual employees. And apologies, my children are definitely in the background. What I'm trying to understand is, how the analysis is different if we want to. Okay, I'm not sure I'll be able to make it through the question. How we can collect data from, the candidates that are coming in, because I think that's also important to track for a lot of the diversity purposes that we're talking about. And also, I'm interested to know from the perspective of recruiters who we often work with, what they can do, because they're the first touch points in making sure that we get diverse candidates in the pipeline. So I would really be interested to hear your take on how the analysis applies at the recruitment stage and interviewing.
Who would like to take that on?
I mean, I'll take part of it, and then hi Jackie, hope you're well. Long time no speak. Yeah, it's a very good question, and actually a lot of what and I will touch on this as well as we go through, but maybe I'll bring it to the fore now, is that a lot of the commitments that VC and PE, law firms, other professional services organisations are asked to sign up to do contain some commitment to monitor that type of data, to collect that type of data in terms of people who kind of apply for your role. So not necessarily just people within your organisation, but those who apply there for roles. I think in the charter for talent in for Black talent in finance and professions, I think it has something around that. I think also there was a letter from an open letter to law firms and GCs that was in the Times on I think it was Thursday last week, which contains a diversity and inclusion toolkit to enable the sort of standardization of data collection, and it does talk about I've forgotten the name of the law. I know it's Baroness Scotland, and I can't remember who the other person was. But the equivalent of the sort of almost like the Rooney Rule, or in the US, right, around who it is that you are interviewing. So I think it certainly is capable of being collected. It requires a consent. I think as Amanda has identified, for recruiters, it will require them to give the express consent, get the express consent from candidates, in their capacity as a it will be as a data processor and controller, and a permission to pass that on to the relevant law firm. So it is absolutely capable of being collected. And I think from a recruiter perspective, and again, I'm not a data protection specialist, but what we seek to do is to make it very clear from the outset is that we want that data. Well, first off, we say we don't, we reject non-diverse shortlists, and I think the implication from that is that actually they have to do some work around making sure that they present a diverse shortlist, which again means that they have to actually dig a bit deeper as to some of the characteristics of the people that they put forward. And again, not all of this is optics. Some of this is, and again, I'm a director of a charity that looks at social mobility. The social mobility piece is very difficult to unpick sometimes, but we do want that data, and we are furnished with that by recruiters. But consent is a key issue.
Thank you.
Oh, I was going to say, Jacqueline, building on what David said, and there's a lot of very valuable data collected by the diversity of applicants and on the Matter onboarding forms, or just the onboarding forms. But a lot of this data is contained in just a desktop folder. And it can be, for example, in the graduate recruitment or the recruitment team for that specified area. And a lot of it, from being in a PDF or a Word file, it's unstructured, where someone's responsibility needs to be creating a structured data set from those forms, tracking it by year, tracking it by role, and creating an indicative data set or even a data model to determine, okay, what are the patterns here? Where are we going to keep this information? Who's going to be in charge of gathering this information, putting it into a form, whether it's Excel or Power BI or an internal HR data management tool, and finding a way that someone in the organization is accountable for maintaining this, the record keeping, and also saying, okay, what should we change on the onboarding form, and what data is sensitive, what data is not sensitive based on the regulations in that area. And having a system in place to create structured data sets from a lot of the very valuable information that's created on the onboarding forms, as well as things such as, let's say someone wants to disclose a few months in that they have a disability. Where's that information kept? Having a structured data set of the sensitive data, I'd say, is really important, but it's not something that immediately comes to mind for a team to say, oh, let's create a repository of this information.
And I think, as you identify, Jackie, it's really sensitive in the real world if you're dealing with potential applicants, right? It's within your organization, you may have a culture of trust, a really developed culture of trust and a clear purpose, which enables and facilitates people sharing that data. Whereas if you're interfacing with someone for the first time who's coming into your prospective entrance to your organization, that trust isn't necessarily there. So, I'm going to be thinking, well, why are you using this data? For what purpose? Can I trust you with this data if it is around, disability or socioeconomic groups, etc. So again, consent is a key issue. It's just coming to my head. The rule is the Scotland Wolf rule, which is, forgive me, Dame Fiona Wolf. It's the Scotland Wolf rule, and again, it's sort of it's an outcome focused certification, where firms who adhere to the rule have to gauge application and success rate in terms of diverse candidates. So again, it's that application piece which I think you're focused on in terms of how you collect that. And again, I think you ask your recruiters to provide that if they are coming through a recruitment agency, and it's conversion into actual offers and or jobs. And you get, I guess, two levels of certification. One is for getting the diverse list in the first place, and the kind of super accreditation is for actually converting that into an offer and a place of permanent employment. But clearly those both require the data to be available to you.
David, just repeat the name of the
It's
rule.
called the Scotland Wolf Rule. So it's Baroness Patricia Scotland, who is, I think she was the first Black female Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and Dame Fiona Wolf, who's a lawyer. She was president of the Law Society.
Okay.
Right.
I have one more question, if I may. Going back to the Article 9 rules in terms of how to establish the sort of the legal basis to collect sensitive data, and obviously consent is one of them. If we're collecting data, including sensitive data via an anonymous survey, is it the case that that doesn't act, if it's truly anonymous, as you say, and you check that there aren't, you know, ways indirectly of being able to identify people, is it the case that that doesn't actually represent personal data because it's not personally identifiable, and therefore the same rules don't apply in terms of having to actually gain express consent because it's not personal data to start with, because it's all anonymous?
So there's different interpretations on this. So in terms of anonymized data subject to the GDPR, once data is truly anonymized and individuals are no longer identifiable, the data won't necessarily fall within the scope of the GDPR and it becomes easier to use. But it depends on the nature of the organization, because sometimes, for example, if an organization has 100 people and there's very few people with that, there also needs to be a determinants based on how representative is this data going to be. And there's a whole entire there's an entire topic on the anonymization and the I can't even pronounce it, but the pseudonymization of data as well.
And Maria, it's a really great point. And again, you know, it's as good as turning into a discussion rather. I think slides are for guidance, but it's a really good point in that, you know, a lot of organizations will use outside organizations effectively to collate a lot of their data to avoid some of the pitfalls of being either a data controller or processor, or you know, again, in smaller organizations, you know, Amanda alluded to the fact that you may have, you know, you might have a GC who would be phenomenally busy on lots of things, but you may also have someone who's specifically tasked with dealing with data, or you might not, which is the case in a lot of organizations. So a lot of this is contracted out, certainly around the collection and then anonymization, so you don't have that problem as an organization in terms of meeting those particular requirements. I think also there are some other benefits to using an outside organization in some instances, around them being able to show that kind of track record of having dealt with data in a very sensitive manner, and they can kind of convey to your people that, look, this is what we do day in, day out. We collect data, anonymized data, and we shift it back to organizations in a way that is still ascertainable and actionable. But we have done this for years, so we know, we understand what we're doing, as opposed to, you know, a law firm is a law firm, but are they experts at data collection? Possibly not. As a VC expert, you're great at placing capital with, you know, with startup entrepreneurs, but actually, are you clued up, or do you have the systems in place to enable you to process sensitive data in a very sensitive way, or does it make sense from a cost benefit analysis for you to establish that? So we use an outside organization to collect a lot of our data, and to help us, like quantitative and qualitative, and to help us in that respect. And again, that distance, I think, for a whole bundle of skeptical lawyers often helps around showing that you're using a professional organisation for that purpose.
And what kinds of data, or what stages of the employment relationship are you sort of outsourcing that collection?
So what do you mean? I mean, in terms of what in terms of the sample, you're talking about the sample, the people that we're asking, or what? Sorry.
The type of data that is being collected.
Okay, the type of data that's being collected is around all of the diversity characteristics that you might want to, or the headlines that you might want to collect. Obviously around gender, around race and ethnicity, around social mobility, around sexuality. Right, so the principal heads. There are also some qualitative data that we seek to pick up as well, which I think is incredibly important, particularly again if we're talking through a race and ethnicity lens, circumstances where you might have a small sample size, and so you know the quantitative data that you might have doesn't necessarily, might be misleading or from year to year, because if you have 2 black employees and they both leave, you're up from whatever it is, 2% or 5% to 0% in one year. What does that tell you about your organization? Well, I think you have to interrogate the qualitative stuff as well around that. So that's principally the information that we seek to collect.
Okay.
I was also going to say, Maria, that the Information Commissioner Office has a really helpful code on the conduct of anonymization. It provides guidance on the techniques, and it suggests the application of this test called the motivated intruder test to ensure the adequacy of de-identification.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Right. Thank you, everyone. David, shall we continue with your?
Yeah, I mean, I think last thing I'd add is that my understanding is that the equality group, this is is fortunate. I think the equality group does some of that work around the kind of questionnaire process structure and anonymization of that data. So I'm sure Alex and the guys will be able to talk to you offline about how that works in practice. Again, I think it's particularly in small organizations, or when we're talking about race and ethnicity where you've got a small sample, I think that external piece is quite powerful. So jumping forward, and again, I'm keen for this to be a discussion, and some of this has been covered, and I'll reiterate that I'm not a diversity and inclusion professional. I'm a restructuring partner, so I deal in sort of distressed situations, insolvencies, that sort of stuff, working for private equity, but also working for banks and the hedge funds, investment banks, and the like, and corporates as well. But what I have done is get myself involved in a number of diversity and inclusion initiatives over the years, particularly through a race and ethnicity and social mobility lens, as per Alex's kind intro to kind of what I do. So I think some of the challenges that I'm going to seek to illuminate are from possibly a slightly different perspective. And they're not from the perspective of a D&I professional, they're from the perspective of someone in the business. Not to say D&I professionals are not in the business, but if you see what I mean, if you're talking about law firms, you think about lawyers. If you're thinking about VC, you're probably thinking about a VP or whoever, or someone actually doing the evaluation, handing out money to entrepreneurs. So I have that perspective, and maybe that gives me a slightly different perspective on life. So thanks, Alex. And so the data process and integrity piece is absolutely critical. I put up the example of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, which is obviously it's a very controversial and widely criticised report. I'm taking a singular statistic from there in terms of the ethnicity pay gap reported at 2.3%, but that's based on a sample size of 1% of the population, whereas others are talking about an ethnicity pay gap of nearer 13-14%. Now, the reason why I highlight that is that there has to be data integrity, so in terms of sample size and the like, but there has to be process integrity too, in that you cannot prejudge where you want to go in terms of what actions you want to take, or what you want it to look like. And we alluded to this earlier in terms of firms of all type. Keon alluded to firms of all type seeking to sort of gerrymander the data to fit a certain narrative. Your employees will be smart people. They will see through that immediately. And particularly if you're looking for a race and ethnicity lens, and particularly in the last year or so, I think members of your workforce will see through that. So you need to be transparent about your purpose, which is to you're starting, if you're at the beginning of your journey, you're starting your journey and you're seeking to gain data to make an assessment of the things that you might need to do, or the things you might need to focus on, rather than having a set kind of outcome or set of results in your mind. Amanda's touched on making responses anonymous and communicating clearly when you send the survey out. I think that goes without saying, particularly for a race and ethnicity lens, given sample sizes. And what I would say, based on our own experience, is around race fluency and language, that you've got to be really conscious of the language that you use, because non-inclusive language can inadvertently offend respondents and prevent them from answering honestly. You're obviously asking people to be really vulnerable, the language that you use is absolutely key to getting that engagement. You can't actually take it for granted that actually people will use the same type of language, that different people will use different language and may be offended by different language, but you've got to be conscious of that when you're formulating the questionnaire as to what might be appropriate and what is not appropriate. It goes back to what you say around what was Sasha said around interrogating some of this or collecting some of this in certain jurisdictions is difficult, but even in the UK, and we've all seen the evolution of language. I mean, I talk a little bit about the BAME the BAME kind of terminology later, in that I've always believed that it's really imprecise, and if you're looking for a solution, all of us and what we do, we kind of look to see what the actual issue is, and we need disaggregation and actual analysis, granularity of data in order to figure out what the solutions look like. Again, not necessarily helpful to use BAME in that context of data collection if you're looking to get, again, really into the granularity of that. But for certain purposes, it may well be helpful, again, to show the disparity between a kind of a holistic BAME outcome and a Black outcome or an Asian outcome or whatever it might be, again, to just show you the value of actually disaggregation in that context. I think intersectionality is absolutely key as well. So you may have a section of your questionnaire which is devoted to race or gender or to or ethnicity or to disability, but actually looking at that in a holistic way is super important. My view has always been that diversity might be a simple fix, in some ways, by recruiting, other than a particular characteristic, people in your own image. So I can certainly say that I think certain law firms have been guilty of this in the past, in that, what do you do to solve your ethnicity problem? Well, you go out to Oxbridge and you get sons of Ghanaian diplomats, and I'm Ghanaian, my background, sons of Ghanaian diplomats, right, who've had private school education, been to Oxbridge. Actually, are you getting then, you're getting some diversity, but are you getting the richness of diversity that you actually want, that creates those outcomes that we all know that we want around challenge and around ideas and the like? Do you get that richness? Well, maybe not, but you've ticked your box, as Keil noted, around one particular element of diversity. So you cannot ignore intersectionality. That's an absolutely key part, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult, and it's very difficult to get people to actually submit some of the data, which might be, again, about sexuality. It might be very difficult for them to submit that data in a way that gives you that insight, which you can then action. Next, Alex. Yeah, so again, this I sound like a broken record about small sample sizes, but I think it's really important. It's really important, and particularly where those small sample sizes can either identify particular individuals in your organization, and that's why sometimes contracting this out externally is really important. But also, again, interrogating that data in a sensible fashion. I've used the example here of you look at the population of the UK and the number and the percentage of people from ethnic minority backgrounds in the UK. You might look at your organisation and go, oh well, okay, that tallies, right? But then you look at the representation spread, and that might be manifest itself in an ethnicity pay gap, in that you might find that actually the senior roles are all occupied by white middle-aged males, and so from that perspective, you get yourself comfortable with the top line, but you haven't interrogated the data in a thorough enough way, or in a way that might create some uncomfortable truths. But you have to be prepared to confront those uncomfortable truths and be vulnerable around that, and commit in some ways to publish that information in a way that makes you vulnerable or makes you accountable against your next steps. And I won't underestimate how difficult it is for certainly in professional services, but I know from speaking to clients how difficult it is to be vulnerable, right? You always want to be seen to be doing well or being really, really good, but actually you just build that authenticity and trust, I think, with your people, if you are prepared to say, look, we're not doing great, but these are the things that we are doing in order to get better. that authenticity is absolutely key. And I've put in there a reference to the new UK Model Diversity Survey, which is the piece I referenced earlier around General Counsel coming together to promote a toolkit that enables this collection of actionable data, and in a way that will help you internally, but also certainly helps law firms internally, but also helps in terms of efficiency of collection and presentation of data. Because I'm assuming that all you guys from investors and the like are being asked some pretty hard questions from your investors around diversity and inclusion and what you're actually doing, and you want to be able to show that you are doing a lot, so you have a narrative around that. But you also, again, there's an element of competition in this, right? You want to be known as the best, but how do you do that? You know, you have to have comparable data. And again, guys like the Equality Group for the Inclusive Index Score is really helpful in that respect, in terms of seeking to evidence real excellence in this particular field. What I would say is that you know, people can get obsessed by the quantitative data, and I think we as an organization have found ourselves in that space, in that you focus on the data and the outcomes from the data, as Keon referenced, but actually, you know, you then lose some of the things that you're seeking to achieve in terms of real substantive change, because you're focused too much on the objective metric, rather than actually what does the organization feel like from an inclusion perspective or from a culture perspective, which can be lost. Which leads me on to the next slide, Alex. So again, this is around honesty and vulnerability, and in my experience, you know, you've got to ask yourself the honest question: are you credible? What's your track record, external and internal? Have you got anything to declare as an organisation or to your people, right? In terms of incidents, or in terms of things that they may have seen or heard. You kind of need, sometimes you need senior leadership or a champion or someone to address that before you get to the start mark. Otherwise, there'll be a healthy dose of, certainly in law firms, and lawyers are paid to be skeptical. There's a healthy degree of skepticism about what you might be trying to do. I think in the VC/PE space, in particular, you have the internal challenge, but you also have the external challenge in terms of, have you put your money where your mouth is around inclusion. So I've got a stat there around Black entrepreneurs, and there's a really interesting study which I've tagged onto the end of this presentation from Cornerstone, who is a VC house which is focused on promotion of Black and minority entrepreneurs, and particularly with a focus to the north, which they feel is kind of, you know, again, lack of focus, underinvested. So from a pure business perspective, there's some, you know, there's some good opportunities there. There's less competition in and around that ground. But the reason why I reference it here is that, you know, people within my organization challenge me as to, okay, we want to do all this stuff internally, but what are we doing in terms of the communities that we serve, or the communities in which we operate? Are we doing anything here? What are our plans in this respect? Because this goes to how serious are we about our commitment to moving the dial. So I would say addressing that is a real challenge, that you have to look at the internal and external I think in terms of the diversity piece and inclusion, I honestly think that inclusion is so important, and possibly even more important than diversity, insofar as inclusion is the thing which promotes better diversity. If you get a diverse team in, we know from what attrition rates look like, again, I'm using a legal industry example, that there is accelerated attrition. For, you look at the studies from you know, Matt Raff from Keys and the guys at Rare Recruitment, and they do a study on attrition rates, and there is accelerated attrition for, if you want to use your term, BAME, yes, okay, but also for Black lawyers within large law firms, and it's so marked that there has to be something underlying that. And a lot of the factors that that study illuminates are around inclusion. And inclusion is so difficult because, again, it's not so necessarily something that you can just identify with quantitative data. You know, inclusion is people's day-to-day experiences, and inclusion might not necessarily be consistent with the messaging coming down from senior leadership. Senior leadership is often not the problem. Senior leadership, and I think in your respective organizations, will kind of get it. They'll understand the importance of inclusion. But I think where it really matters is the everyday contact that people have, how they feel about the organization. The kind of, people talk about microaggressions. I talk about incivilities. You know, again, granular examples are do you feel that you are disproportionately ignored and interrupted? Do you feel that you're not given eye contact? Your name's not pronounced correctly? There's assumption about your skills, about your temperament. All this goes to culture and how included you might feel in an organization. And those things aren't easy to monitor. I mean, we have a sort of a quarterly survey touching on certain of these elements. But that is something capturing the mood of your organization, which is really important, and really important to, again, to stimulating the debate, but the sharing also the data that leads to your quantitative data. So, and in that mix and in that context, you can't leave anyone behind. You have to include the whole organization, I think, in that process of how you're actually feeling, or the quantitative stuff, because you know, you have to get a gauge on how your again, if we're talking about race and ethnicity, how your ethnic minority staff are feeling, but actually, you know, a large function of that is the interaction with everybody else in the organization. So you have to understand how they are feeling, how they are dealing with life as well, to get that kind of relative piece. And again, in terms of relationships and the like, it's obviously a two-way street. So you have to understand how people are treating and or interacting with each other in order to test the temperature on your organization. So supremely important. The last thing I would say on this particular part is that I think it's an obvious point, though, that seniority often influences how people feel, or what people feel about the temperature in their organization, in that, you know, senior people often don't experience the micro incivilities that I've just talked about, in terms of being ignored and interrupted, criticized, not getting eye contact, having their name pronounced incorrectly, those kind of things. And actually they feel that the environment in which they operate is far more inclusive than, you know, maybe someone at the start of their career. So you have to have that overlay, or an understanding of that overlay, when you're collating your data. Jackie, you had a question.
Yeah, I have a question on target setting. Well, I completely agree with everything you said around inclusion. I wanted to get your views on setting targets for different diversity metrics within your organization, and setting them at different levels. We spoke very briefly about the US, which is obviously a very different market, where they have things like affirmative action, and the concept of even setting targets is not new. But I think it is something that doesn't happen in the UK, and I'm not sure of the employment law framework around it, if anyone can speak to that. But if an organization wanted to say, okay, actually, let's say a law firm, we want to make sure that we have, you know, if we look at the UK and maybe, I don't know, the percentage of Black people in London, it's I think around 10%. We think, okay, we want to mirror that demographic. We want 10% Black partners or Black associates. And how far can an organization push that? So I think I'm wondering, what is your view on targets and target setting? And then what is your view on organizations, and to the extent that they should really push to achieve those targets, meaning, you know what, I'm going to truly set aside space for Black candidates in this upcoming associate class, for example?
Yeah, I mean, look, those are two great questions, and very plain in the first in terms of my view on setting targets. I'm very much an advocate of targets, because without targets, I'm not necessarily sure. Firms need to be able to monitor their progress, but monitoring and actually celebrate the small successes as well, and they need to be incentivized to meet those to meet those particular numbers. Again, you know, there's lots of organizations. Senior leadership is not the issue, in that senior leadership can feel what you're trying to do with their heads and their heart and their pockets, right? But actually getting others to move, which is really important. You've got to figure out what are the key drivers in that respect. And I think having kind of objective targets does cause people to change their behavior. It's amongst a number of tools that are available in the toolbox. But from a UK employment law perspective, you will see that my firm DLA Piper has announced goals publicly. And we've been careful about goals, but we had the debate around goals and or targets. There are other firms like Linklaters, Clifford Chance and the like who've announced targets with particular reference to race and ethnicity around promotion, in particular. Promotion to partner is one of those key metrics which people look at. If you look at the lawyer, again, I'm being very law centric, so forgive me for a minute, but if you look at the lawyer this year, now is promotion season, and so with almost every announcement from a big firm, they will break down how many of their partner promotions are female, how many of their partner promotions are from ethnic minority backgrounds. So there is the piece of people proffering that data, but clearly there are organisations which are issuing targets as a call to arms to move. I think the bigger question to my mind, well, not a bigger question, or a big question to my mind, is how you actually move towards those targets. And that's why this debate and the leave no one behind piece is really important, because, you know, again, I think there was an article in the Times a couple of weeks ago around this, in that, you know, what does, you know, fundamentally, if you look at this, what does greater diversity and inclusion mean? What does it actually mean? Does it mean actually some people giving up power? In real terms, it probably does. It probably does. And so what are those people going to feel? They're going to feel threatened, right? And so again, if you're moving towards a particular target, those people who might be in the dominant group may well feel threatened. So you actually have to explain what it is you're trying to do and why, and be very sensitive about how as well, because, you know, along the way, you know, people may accept that they may have benefited from structural inequalities in the past, but they can say, hey, well, that's not my fault. You know, that's not my individual fault. I've been doing what I've been doing, right? So why should I be? There's a perception of, you know, why should I be penalised, or why should I be held back because of this target that you have? It's not fair. It's not equitable, etc. Those are debates which are constantly had. So that part is the bit that is very, very difficult, right? When you're dealing with individuals around their journey and what this means and what the targets actually, and moving towards targets means in terms of sort of practical behaviours around sort of sponsorship and mentorship, promotion of people.
Thank you.
So moving on really quickly, I've thrown in a couple of elements in there around just to finish up around the kind of culture and trust piece, on what you are doing, evidencing internally and externally, again, to help that that culture of inclusion. You know, and you know, I can't, and it's probably one for another day, but, you know, trying to cultivate an inclusive culture is incredibly difficult, and you know, leading inclusively is obviously a key part of that. And there are a number of ways that you can do that. I've just set out here some data from the HR Data Hub, which is interesting in some respects. Some outcomes I didn't necessarily expect around, you know, what makes a difference to progression in terms of ethnic minority hiring, recruitment, and retention, and what things that people might be doing and the impact that those things might be having. I would have thought certain things would be higher up on the list or lower down on the list, but that's an indication. But what it is designed to do is just to say, you need to have a checklist of the things that you are doing or the things that you might commit to do or be able to do, and be able to present that internally based on the data that you obviously have collated, rather than have a sort of a predetermined list. But that piece is really important. And again, the last couple of slides, and again, this is turned to discussion, which I'm really grateful for, talk a little bit to what I talked around the Charter for Black Talent in the Finance and the Professions, which is definitely worth looking at, and also around the work of Cornerstone Partners. So Cornerstone did a report this week, which has some really valuable conclusions about, again, from a VC perspective, around how they are interfacing with the community of entrepreneurs, which again adds that credibility, which enables you in your data collection journey. So that's really all that that's all really